Hello everyone, my name is Sophia Worrell, and today we will look at the legal immigration process of America and those people who came here freely for a better life on this day 25. So let's look first at the U.S. immigration legal system before 1965. The United States experienced major waves of immigration during the colonial era. Many immigrants came to America seeking greater economic opportunity, while some, such as the Pilgrims in the early 1600s, arrived in search of religious freedom. Individual states regulated immigration prior to the 1892 opening of Ellis Island, the country's first federal immigration station. New laws in 1965 ended the quota system that favored European immigrants. The quota system was the concept of organizing society by racial, gender, language, and demographic attributes. The basic premise is that to have demographics represented at all levels and aspects of civilizations according to national statistics. The Immigration Act of 1924 limited the number of immigrants allowed entry into the United States through national origins quota. The quota provided immigration visas to 2% of the total number of people of each nationality in the United States. As of the 1890 national census, it completely excluded immigrants from Asia. We'll look at immigration in the colonial era. From the earliest days, America has been a nation of legal immigration, starting with its original inhabitants who crossed the land bridge connecting Asia and North America tens of thousands of years before. By the 1500s, the first Europeans, led by the Spanish and French, had begun establishing settlements in what would become the United States. In 1607, England founded their first permanent settlement in present-day America at Jamestown in the Virginia colony. In January 1st, 1892, Anne Moore, a teenager from County Cork, Ireland, was the first immigrant processed at Ellis Island. She had made the nearly 2-week journey across the Atlantic Ocean with her two younger brothers. Annie later raised a family in New York City's Lower East Side. So now let's look at a list of groups of people who came here for freedom to practice their faith and religion, or who came in search of employment to build up this new nation. The Pilgrims. Some of the first settlers came in search of freedom to practice their faith. In 1620, a group of roughly 100 people, later known as the Pilgrims, fled religious persecution in Europe and arrived at present-day Plymouth, Massachusetts, where they established a colony. The Puritans. They were soon followed by a larger group also seeking religious freedom. An estimated 20,000 Puritans migrated to the region between 1630 and 1640 and established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Other white Europeans, a larger share of immigrants, came to America seeking economic opportunities. However, because the price of passage was steep, an estimated one-half or more of the white Europeans who made the voyage did so by becoming indentured servants. Although some people voluntarily indentured themselves, others were kidnapped in European cities and forced into servitude in America. The English. Additionally, thousands of English convicts were shipped across the Atlantic as indentured servants as well. They weren't just black slaves, the Irish. Another major wave of immigration occurred from around 1815 to 1865. The majority of these newcomers hail from Northern and Western Europe. Approximately one-third came from Ireland, which experienced a massive famine in the mid-19th century. Typically impoverished, these Irish immigrants settled near their point of arrival in cities along the East Coast. Germans. Around the 19th century, the United States received some 5 million German immigrants. Many of them journeyed to present-day Midwest to buy farms or congregated in such cities as Milwaukee, St. Louis, and Cincinnati. Asians. During the mid-1800s, a significant number of Asian immigrants settled in the United States. Lured by news of California gold rush, some 25,000 Chinese had migrated there by the early 1815s. Protestants. An influx of newcomers resulted in anti-immigrant sentiment among certain fractions of Americans native-born, predominantly Anglo-Saxon Protestant population. This new arrival were often seen as unwanted competitions for jobs, while many Catholics, especially the Irish, experienced discrimination for their religious belief. The Chinese. One of the first significant pieces of federal legislation aimed at restricting immigration was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned Chinese laborers from coming to America. Californians had agitated for new laws blaming the Chinese who were willing to work for less, which caused a decline in wages. Now let's move on to this what happened after the Civil War. So following the Civil War, the United States experienced a depression in 1870s that contributed to a slowdown in immigration. Ellis Island and federal immigration regulation. For much of the 1800s, the federal government left immigration policy to individual states to regulate the legal immigration process. However, by the final decade of the century, the government decided it needed to step in to handle the ever-increasing influx of newcomers. In 1890, President Benjamin Harrison designated Ellis Island, located in New York Harbor near the Statue of Liberty, as a federal immigration station. More than 12 million immigrants entered the United States through Ellis Island during its years of operation from 1892 to 1954. Let's see how immigration started again. The Italians. Between 1880 and 1920, a time of rapid industrialization and urbanization, America received more than 20 million immigrants. Beginning in the 1890s, the majority of arrivals were from Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe. In that decade alone, over 60,000 Italians migrated to America, and in 1920, more than 4 million had entered the United States. Jews from Eastern Europe fleeing religious persecution also arrived in large numbers. Over 2 million entered the United States between 1880 and 1920. The peak year for admission of new immigrants was 1907, when approximately 1.3 million people entered the country legally. Within a decade, the outbreak of World War I, 1914 to 1918, it caused a decline in immigration, but in 1917, Congress enacted legislation requiring immigrants over 16 years to pass a literacy test, and in the early 1920s, immigration quotas were established. This is where the Immigration Act of 1924 created a quota system that restricted entry to 2% of the total number of people of each nationality in America. It was a system that favored immigrants from Western Europe and prohibited immigrants from Asia. Now let's look at the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. Immigration plummeted during the global depression of the 1930s and World War II between 1939 and 1945. So between 1930 and 1950, American foreign-born population decreased. After the war, Congress passed special legislation enabling refugees from Europe and the Soviet Union to enter the States. Following the Communist Revolution in Cuba in 1959, hundreds of thousands of refugees from the island nation also gained admittance to the United States. In 1965, Congress passed the Immigration of Nationality Act, which did away with quotas based on nationality and allowed Americans to sponsor relatives from their countries of origin. As a result of this act and subsequent legislation, the nation experienced a shift in immigration patterns. The Caribbean islands. The first wave of large-scale voluntary migration from the Caribbean to the United States began in the first half of the 20th century and consisted mostly of laborers, including guest workers from the British West Indian programs who worked in U.S. agriculture in mid-1940s, as well as political exiles from Cuba. Now, unfortunately, from the 17th to the 19th century, hundreds of thousands of African slaves came here to America against their will. But we must be reminded that there are many of us of African descent that are now being stereotyped with those who act barbaric and unintelligent. Their thug-like behavior is not what we want represented of our culture anymore. That is not God's way. That is not the American way. It is time to build a culture that is peaceful, loving, and kind. Thank you.